Okay, everyone, we are at the last video of the week. And so far you've gotten a couple of key concepts down. We've got doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, settler colonialism. That should be one. I want you to really let that one bake in. But also, just what we mean by indigenous peoples. I think that was an important thing. And also one of the most critical concepts is sovereignty. So make sure you're getting a handle of all of those. And then I also made a video on chapter 1 of my book. That's the one that we're going in. And for this video, I just want to highlight a couple of key concepts that I want you to focus on for chapter 2 and get a number of, or maybe get a feel for what it is that I'm trying to do and accomplish here. So we see with the Montana law, Indian Education for All, a really productive attempt to be inclusive. Mainstream education is public education of tribal peoples, of Native students, making the curriculum more inclusive, making the pedagogy more inclusive. And of course, this is really good stuff. And you don't want to challenge it too much, because in the history of Native education reform, of course, these are really good advances, right? Well, from a settler colonialism perspective, I'm going to make the case that, even though we're seeing what we might describe as positive advances, or we're overcoming certain things, that the structure of violence, settler colonial violence, is still very much part of the lived experience of Native students, tribal peoples, indigenous peoples. So in this chapter, chapter 2, this is where I lay out a theory of colonization. That's the whole settler colonialism. But I also try to give historical interpretations of U.S. indigenous relations. And I'm looking at broader policies that the federal government or Supreme Court decisions, laws that get enacted by Congress that seem to be a way of thinking about, or they are ways of thinking about, U.S. indigenous relations. And I'll talk about those in a bit. As these are historical interpretations, there's one historical interpretation of what these various movements or eras are. I'm going to offer another way of thinking about the relationship of U.S. indigenous relations from a settler colonial perspective. So in chapter 2, it's page 40 is where I want us to start. And so if you haven't gotten the book, get that book immediately. We're deep into it, so I don't want you to get too far behind. But if you've got the book, I'm looking at page 40, and that's where I offer what I call a mainstream account of U.S. indigenous relations. And the mainstream account is something like this: that in one era, the U.S. government's attitude towards Native peoples is a certain way, right? It swings toward a certain way. And I frame it in terms of pro-sovereignty or anti-sovereignty. And so, and then something happens, a policy gets changed or new evidence shows up, and there's a swing in another direction. So let's just imagine that in one era, there's a swing to diminish tribal sovereignty. And then evidence shows up and there's a swing to promote tribal sovereignty. And then something happens and it just does this swinging back and forth. And this narrative kind of puts forward this idea that from the 1880s, basically, this is the time of the boarding schools, and I'll talk about an era of this, to the time that we're in now, that even though these swings of pro and anti are going on, that the march of U.S. indigenous relations, that it's a march of progress, that things have gotten better, right? It's no longer of the 1800s where there's genocides and all that. We're away from boarding schools, and that sovereignty is basically being furthered and promoted, and now we're being inclusive, right? This is the Montana law. Well, that's the mainstream education or mainstream account of U.S. indigenous relations. And I focus on education in this chapter, a way of thinking about how education becomes the site where we can see where this is, something that we can challenge. Well, in the settler colonial frame, the argument that I'm giving is that even though we perceive these back and forths, these swings of pro and anti-indigenous, that really what's happening is that the relationship between U.S. indigenous relations, that these are relations always caught up in a settler colonial frame, even in times that appear to be, quote, positive or progressive. That settler colonial relation has not been interrogated, has not been challenged. And that means it's still in place. That means there's still colonizing power. And if we follow what settler colonialism is, it means it's a logic of elimination, borrowing Patrick Wolf's phrase. So in any era, even though things look like they're positive, the argument is because of that settler colonial relation or settler society or whatever way you want to describe it, that progress is will be limited. And that sets up the argument for decolonization. Okay, so on page 40 through 42 is where I give the mainstream account. I want you to look at three main eras in in indigenous studies. We basically divide history of U.S. indigenous relations in like batches of decades. So I'm going to divide, and this is arbitrary at some level, but at the same time, it's recognizable. This is kind of how we talk to each other in Native studies. The era that I begin with is what we call the allotment and assimilation era. And we already talked about this to some extent with the boarding schools. And roughly from about 1880 to the 1930s is the kind of framework. And so think back to lecture 2 where I described the boarding schools. I'm going to, we're going to keep talking about schooling, right? But the boarding school era, as you saw in that documentary, was a very brutal time. And there's so many more facts that I can give. You can pick those up in the chapters. So I won't labor them here. But during this era, the intention of the U.S. government was to to use Pratt, Captain Richard Pratt's famous phrase, and I referenced this in week 2, kill the Indian, save the man, right? It was a direct assault on Native children. It was the point of this was to eradicate Native identity, language, etc. One of the key pieces of legislation during this time was the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act, there's so much to say. Again, read it in the chapter, you'll get the gist. And this is where there's an attempt by the federal government, even by people who believe they were doing the good, was to transform Native peoples from their stereotypes or understandings of Native peoples as, say that wandering nomadic, to actual farmers who took up individualism, American exceptionalism, right? To basically make Native peoples white. There's a lot more we're going to say about the allotment era, especially with the Dawes Act. That's key in understanding how reservations today still operate. But then something happens in the 1930s, and this is where a more progressive attitude towards Native people starts to take shape. This is found in the person John Collier. He's basically appointed in the Roosevelt administration, and this is what we call the Indian New Deal. It's like an era of progressive politics, right? The attitude now has, quote, swung from anti-sovereignty to, quote, pro-sovereignty during this time. And this is roughly the 1930s to the 1950s, 60s, thereabouts. There's some gray areas there. But during this time, Native peoples, this is the emergence of the modern tribal nation as we understand this. The idea of constitutional governments in tribal nations. This is when sovereignty really starts to take hold, right? Thinking about what sovereignty is in this modern sense. Well, the Collier policies, what was called the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, a little bit before that, though, basically puts an end to boarding schools, puts an end to the policies of Native eradication. Instead, Collier invests money and time and effort into reorganizing tribes so they become more self-determined in their ability to further their sovereignty or further their lifeways, cultures, etc. Again, I describe Collier in greater detail in the chapter, so just go back and you'll see what I mean by that. There's a couple of things that happened in the 1950s. You're going to pick this up in the documentary. This is called the termination era, termination relocation era. Don't bother with that for this chapter. I want you to jump ahead to what we're kind of calling the self-determination era of the 1970s. And the self-determination era is a time when the racialization of Native peoples really take hold, is sort of thinking about Native peoples in a civil rights discourse, very similar to, say, African Americans and other ethnic groups who are pushing for structural rights like voting or access to housing or stuff like that. Well, Native peoples get brought up in that same discourse, especially with termination and relocation. So basically, in the 1950s, the US government swings back to an anti-sovereignty and begins to break up certain tribes for access to lands. Again, you're going to see that in the documentary Broken Treaties for the Oregon case. But by the 1960s, Native peoples are finding themselves in locations that they weren't necessarily comfortable with, like big cities, San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, Minneapolis. And so we have the emergence of what's called the pan-Indian identity, where in cities where Native peoples were coming from all walks of life, ended up forming solidarity with each other, right? And this is called, kind of like the urban Indian experience, pan-Indian experience. Again, I'll talk, you can read more of that in the book. The mainstream account is kind of this back and forth struggle, right? Well, I'm going to problematize that through a settler colonial lens. And so one of the concepts that I want you to get and make sure you know is this concept of what's called the safety zone theory. This is proposed by a couple of Native scholars, Janine Loma-Wema and Teresa McCarty. They wrote a book a number of years ago called To Remain an Indian. It's a phrase that I love, but their book is just an amazing text. And in this text, they offer what they call the safety zone theory. And so on page 42 is where you'll find this. So make sure you know what that safety zone theory is. And here's the nitty-gritty of it. That the safety zone theory traces the swings of policy, right? The ongoing struggle between US and indigenous relations, right? That traces these swings and doesn't see, the safety zone theory doesn't see these things as like a back and forth sort of thing, but actually, and so I talk about it in the book, let me just quote myself here. The safety zone theory points to a larger pattern at work in US indigenous relations. And if we look through colonizing lens, a settler colonial lens, we're going to see this pattern, what I call a deep, insidious colonizing agenda. I mean, you can't get more direct than that. And here's the claim that I'm making, that the federal government has not ended its colonizing practices, policies, or ideologies. Colonization is ongoing. It endures. The safety zone theory demonstrates control by the federal government as a colonizing nation in relation to Native peoples, even in eras that, quote, promote tribal sovereignty. So think of the Collier administration or the Collier policies, right? Collier was fascinated with Native peoples. He thought, and if you read his work, his diaries, those kinds of things, he thought that Native peoples held the secret to modern existence. He had a very stereotypical, romanticized view. And it seems like even in eras where attention is being paid to Native peoples, right, to uphold their rights, a safety zone idea is to say, it is actually a pattern of the US government not to swing back and forth between pro and anti-indigenous, but to control Native peoples, to limit sovereignty. Even though sovereignty may expand in a certain era, there are still limitations to this. Now think back to one of the videos where I talked about plenary power. It doesn't matter how much Congress passes a law that, quote, supports the self-determination of Native peoples. In the 1970s, that's that era. Well, plenary power is still in place, right? The relationship of colonization is still in place. The safety zone theory says, then what is this whole history of Native reform, education reform about? For Loma-Wema and McCarty, and I follow the argument, it's about controlling that. It's about limiting the sovereignty. It doesn't, and so in some areas, it's not about eradicating that sovereignty. It's simply about putting boundaries around it. And so in times that seem to suggest that Native tribal culture should be eradicated, they're actually controlled as opposed to just being entirely eliminated. We do find examples of elimination. There's no question about that. But what Loma-Wema and McCarty are arguing is that there's a larger pattern at work. And this is critical, especially when I get to my interpretation of this mainstream account. And so here's where I introduce another concept. So right now you've got the safety zone theory. Make sure you got that. From another video, you've got settler colonialism. Now I want you to think about what I call the dominant colonizing voice. And this is found on page 47. And so with this dominant colonizing voice, we're looking at this history of U.S. indigenous relations as a larger pattern of safety zone. Safety zone. Let me reiterate that a bit. Safety zone is this idea of keeping Native identity and culture and sovereignty safe for the colonizer, shaping and forming the Native in such a way that the Native is now palatable to the colonizer. That's what the safety zone theory is suggesting. And schooling, of course, is a big, big place for this. How do you shape and form a child to become less threatening, right? Less pagan? Well, you make them Christians, you make them civilized, quote unquote, in the way that you think all of those things mean. Well, the dominant colonizing voice is that's the word that I use to describe how settler colonial structures are constantly in place, keeping power, the power differential, the asymmetrical power between colonizer and colonized. So here's how I describe the dominant colonizing voice. On page 47, settler colonialism not only helps to explain the problem with the mainstream account, that's basically what I've been saying, it also introduces a second interpretation of U.S. indigenous relations. And the second interpretation, I call it the dominant colonizing voice. This voice in U.S. indigenous relation reveals how the federal government's effort to colonize indigenous minds, bodies, and lands is not an arc of progress, right? This mainstream account of seeing progress is basically happening, but an intentional and ongoing effort to maintain a colonizing relationship between the United States and tribal nations. The dominant colonizing voice reflects and perpetuates a deep, insidious agenda to control Native cultural expressions within each federal policy era. And implicit in each policy era are ideological assumptions about Native peoples. These assumptions inform the way that reformers, right, going back to the boarding school era all the way to the present day, Montana, right, to sort of bring it all together that way. These assumptions inform the way reformers enacted policies and practices within educational contexts. The dominant colonizing voice regards political and educational strategies as good faith efforts to reform American Indian education. And that's in public schools as well. So now you can see what I'm saying a little bit better. The Montana law, a really good, productive, inclusive law. from a dominant colonizing voice, right? Or I'm sorry, from a settler colonial lens, it is a dominant colonizing voice of control, of power, strategies, good faith efforts to do the reforms that are necessary in Native education. But at the end of the day, I'm saying the settler colonial structure remains. And that's going to require a different kind of address. We're going to do something different. And that's where decolonization comes in. So from pages 47, I'm not going to go through all this, 47 through 53, it looks like 54. Make sure you see how I'm charting this new interpretation, the second interpretation. And then just because it's Montana, for me, it was important to just give a quick history of the Montana schooling history. Okay, attempts to reform and all the issues around that. So make sure you read that as well. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Just make sure you get those key concepts down. You got settler colonialism from another video, and that I think this is going to set you up quite well. So now just make sure that you're watching the Broken Treaties documentary. I think that's now, if you go through these videos and then you watch that documentary, it's going to make much more sense. Okay. All right, everybody. Good luck with the videos in the week, and we will see you soon.